I wanted to also continue the conversation you were having with Mr. Womack regarding the budget projections, the administration's plans to cure long-term structural deficits, and what your thoughts may be on how we can work together to solve some of the great fiscal challenges plaguing Washington, D.C. And I think no matter what party you're in, certainly we have to be aware that our country is in a deep well when it comes to our national debt, and that it continues to grow. And I think only in Washington, D.C. would folks pat themselves on the back when the deficit's only $500 billion a year. We know it's been much higher than that. It was over $1 trillion, close to $1.5 trillion when I came into Congress, and Mr. Womack and many others in my class came into Congress. And so progress may be occurring, but we are certainly nowhere where we need to be. And it looks like it may get worse over the next years. The CBO's most recent 10-year forecast projects the deficit will be more than $1 trillion again before 2025, and the national debt will be over $27.3 trillion. I've asked repeatedly in meetings at home and roundtables and town halls how many Americans or how many people in the room would like to see the deficit go to $27 trillion. Strangely, not one hand goes up. And so the entire country doesn't like the direction we're taking fiscally in this country and don't like the projections that are before us. And so I guess when looking at the President's budget submission and as we get ready to work on ours this week, what's the administration's position on does their budget ever balance, and at what point, in what year does it balance, I guess?
So the aim that our budget had, which has been consistent throughout the President's term, is to meet the two key fiscal tests. First, that we bring deficits below 3% of GDP, which is widely recognized as the right fiscal standard, and in fact is well below the average of our deficits over the last 40 years. Our budget would do that in every one of the 10 years of the window. Second, it takes what is currently, and you just referred to this, CBO shows debt increasing as a share of GDP, to stabilize that debt and start to bring it down over the 10-year window. Our budget achieves that goal as well. It's a total of about $1.8 trillion in savings, and it really does it through three key areas. Healthcare savings, which is the single most important thing that we can do to drive down our deficits long term. Second, looking for ways to change our tax code to lower wasteful spending in our tax code. And third, immigration reform. In fact, one of our big challenges, to go to the Chairman's point at the outset, is our demographic challenge. We have, over time, more and more retirees per worker in the country, and immigration reform is one of the most important things we can do to start to rebalance those demographics. CBO says that immigration reform would save almost $1 trillion over 20 years, and even more in the out years. And so those are the three key strategies we pursue.
Well, and I appreciate the President submitting his budget on time and putting ideas on the table. I do think, and I agree with my colleague Mr. Womack, that the elephant in the room, the issue that's being ignored, it continues to be the mandatory spending. And it doesn't just have an impact on the deficits as they continue to grow. And I noticed you say in a quote just this week, the President's budget provides official projections for spending, revenues, deficit, and debt over the 10 years, reflecting the President's proposed policies, including ending sequestration, investing in growth opportunity, and reducing deficits and debt. And I think the deficits don't see a reduction. In terms of GDP, I think you may be correct in terms of historic averages, but we continue to increase that debt nearing 25, 26, 27 trillion. So even with those sort of rosy projections, I do believe our deficits continue to grow. And so I think that's a bit of a misstatement. And it goes to the point that Mr. Womack's making regarding mandatory spending. And it has an impact just not only on deficits as a whole and our debt as a whole, but it has an impact on where we invest. And I note that if you look into to 1960s, we were spending 32 cents out of every dollar in investments and only 14 cents out of every dollar on entitlements. Yet when you get to 2030, that number, by some estimates, is 61 cents out of every federal dollar. So I think whether you're a fiscal conservative and you're concerned about the debt and the interest payments that Americans will be paying, and by some estimates $1 trillion a year by the end of the next decade just in interest payments alone, we all should be concerned about that. But regardless, if you want to invest in education or transportation or research, that won't occur when that group of entitlement spending continues to grow at such a rapid rate. And so I'd look further in the questioning today and in the President's efforts to address that topic for your statements to really take that on, because it's something that we're going to have to work on with both parties.
And let me, I think I was agreeing with you that mandatory spending is critical, and in fact, healthcare costs and really making progress on healthcare costs is the single most important piece of bringing down mandatory spending. And in fact, I think the good news there is that over the last few years, because of the improvements that we've seen, partly due to the Affordable Care Act, CBO now projects we're going to spend over $200 billion less in 2020 on Medicare and Medicaid than they thought just a few years ago. And so continuing to push in that direction, particularly on healthcare spending, is the single most important thing we can do.
Well, I think we would all, Mr. Chairman, I'll wrap up my questions here. I think we would all agree it continues to balloon in an out-of-control way that cannot be sustained. And so while we appreciate the President's submission, we have a long way to go. And in order to get relief on sequestration and in order to invest in other priorities, we're going to have to still continue to find ways to reduce our mandatory spending because it's going to impact everything we do in this town. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.